Look up at almost any drone in the sky today, and the odds are overwhelming that it was made by a single company. Not American, not European, one firm, in one Chinese city. In 2025, when a security company tracked every drone its sensors could detect around the world, more than 8 out of every 10 of them came from DJI. 83% from one brand. It controls around 70% of the entire global drone market, and more than 90% of the camera drones that hobbyists, filmmakers, and farmers actually buy. And then, in December 2025, the United States effectively banned it. The problem? America had almost nothing to replace it with. This is how a company born in a dorm room came to quietly own the world's skies. To understand the dominance, you have to start in 2006. In Shenzhen, with a graduate student named Frank Wang. Wang was obsessed with one problem that had nothing to do with cameras: how to make a small flying machine hold itself steady in the air. Early hobby helicopters were violent, twitchy things that crashed within seconds in the hands of anyone but an expert. Wang's company, DJI, started by selling just the brains, flight control boards for other people's aircraft. He reportedly ran the first version out of his university dorm, then a modest apartment, funneling every yuan back into engineering. For years it was a niche supplier to a tiny community of enthusiasts who had to assemble their own aircraft around DJI's controller. Then, in 2013, came the product that changed everything: the Phantom. It was the first drone you could pull out of a box and fly almost immediately. A stabilized camera, a simple controller, and software that did the hard, invisible work of staying level in a gust of wind. Suddenly, a shot that used to require a helicopter, a pilot, and a film crew could be captured by one person standing in a field with a $1,000 gadget. That phrase, "ready to fly," was the whole revolution. It collapsed a barrier that had stood for the entire history of aerial photography. DJI didn't invent the drone, and it didn't invent the quadcopter. What it invented was the idea that flying one should require no skill at all. And that single insight is what turned a hobbyist gadget into a mass-market product. Within a few years, Wang became the world's first drone billionaire, and for a time Asia's youngest self-made tech billionaire, building a global empire from a device most serious people had written off as a toy. But a clever first product doesn't explain 90% market share. To understand that, you have to understand Shenzhen itself. The city is the densest electronics manufacturing cluster on the planet, a place where, within a single afternoon's drive, you can source a brushless motor, a lithium battery cell, a camera sensor, a radio chip, and a custom-molded plastic shell, and have a working prototype on your desk the next morning. No other place on Earth lets a hardware company iterate that fast. DJI didn't just sit inside that ecosystem, it absorbed it. It vertically integrated, designing its own flight controllers, its own camera gimbals, its own image processing chips and software, and tightly controlling its supply chain end to end. That meant every single year it could ship a drone that was smaller, smarter, longer flying, and cheaper than anything a rival could answer, and it did. In a punishing annual cadence that left competitors perpetually a generation behind. And the competitors fell one by one. GoPro, the action camera giant, launched a drone called the Karma in 2016 with enormous fanfare, and pulled out of the drone business entirely within about 2 years after recalls and lackluster sales. America's own promising startup, 3D Robotics, once seen as the Great Western Hope, tried to fight DJI head-on in consumer drones, burned through its funding, and retreated to making software instead. The pattern repeated across the industry. Anyone who tried to match DJI on hardware simply could not match it on cost. DJI's strategy was brutally simple: release relentlessly, undercut everyone on price, and out-engineer the whole field on the one thing that mattered most: making the flying effortless. By the time Western governments woke up and started worrying about strategic dependence, there was no Western champion left to rally behind. The market hadn't just been won, it had been hollowed out from the inside. Let's put real numbers on just how lopsided this market is. because the scale of it is genuinely hard to believe. By 2024, DJI's annual revenue had climbed past 50 billion yuan, roughly $7 billion, from a product category that barely existed 20 years earlier. In the consumer space, the camera drones ordinary people actually buy. Independent estimates put its share above 90%. In the broader commercial and industrial drone market, the agricultural sprayers dusting rice paddies, the survey drones mapping construction sites, the inspection platforms crawling over power lines and oil rigs, it holds somewhere around 70% globally. And that drone detection study from 2025 is perhaps the most telling figure of all. When a counter-drone company's sensors simply counted what was actually flying overhead. Regardless of who claimed what market share on paper, more than 83% of everything they detected was a DJI. Think about what that means. Out of every 6 drones in the sky, 5 wear the same logo. Now compare that to the field of challengers. America's best-known maker, Skydio, walked away from the consumer market entirely to focus on enterprise and defense customers who could pay a premium. Otto, itself another Chinese firm, is probably the closest direct competitor, and still trails by a wide, lonely margin. There is, today, no Western company with a meaningful share of the global consumer drone market. Not a small share. None. When a single company controls this much of a category, the hardware, the software, the supply chain, and the price floor that everyone else has to live under, it stops being a market leader and becomes something closer to the market itself. Every other player is fighting over the scraps that DJI chooses to leave on the table. And here is what makes that concentration so consequential. Drones long ago stopped being toys. Which means this isn't really a story about gadgets at all. It's a story about who runs a quietly essential piece of the modern economy. Walk through the industries that now depend on a drone every single day. In agriculture across Asia, DJI's spraying drones have become standard equipment, dusting crops faster and cheaper than a tractor or a hired plane. Used by farmers from China to Vietnam to India. In construction and mining, survey drones map sites in an afternoon that used to take a team a week. Energy companies fly them along thousands of miles of power lines and over wind turbines and oil platforms. Replacing dangerous manual inspections, police departments, fire crews, and search and rescue teams launch them over disasters and missing person cases as routinely as they once reached for a flashlight. And the entire film and television industry now treats aerial shots, once the exclusive luxury of big-budget productions with helicopters, as something a single operator can grab for a few $100s. Every one of those use cases, across dozens of countries, quietly standardized on the same hardware from the same company. That's the real depth of the dominance. It isn't just that DJI sells the most drones. It's that whole professions have built their daily workflows, their training, their spare parts, and their software around a single foreign supplier, without anyone ever deciding, as a matter of policy, that they should. Then the world changed, and the stakes stopped being about hobby footage. When Russia invaded Ukraine, both armies reached for the cheapest, most available aerial eyes they could find, and those eyes were made by DJI. The Mavic, a folding drone small enough to fit in a backpack and costing perhaps $1,000 off the shelf, became so utterly ubiquitous on the front lines that soldiers now use the word Mavic generically. The way the rest of us say we'll Google something. It stopped being a brand and became a category. By many battlefield estimates, small consumer-grade quadcopters came to handle the overwhelming majority of short-range reconnaissance and artillery spotting, finding targets, correcting fire, and watching trench lines around the clock. A device originally engineered for wedding videos and real estate listings was suddenly deciding where shells landed and which positions lived or died. And this is exactly where DJI's commercial dominance curdled into raw geopolitical leverage. As the war ground on, China moved to restrict drone exports, reportedly tightening the flow to Ukraine and parts of Europe while supplies continued to reach Russia. Ukraine, dangerously dependent on a product it could not make itself, was thrown into a frantic, expensive scramble to stand up its own domestic drone industry almost from scratch. Under fire. And the lesson landed in every defense ministry quietly watching from the sidelines. If a single foreign company supplies the eyes of your military, then that company's government holds a tap it can tighten or shut off at will. On its own timetable. For its own reasons. Somewhere along the way the cheap camera drone had become critical military infrastructure, in most of the world. It turned out, was simply renting it from Shenzhen. Which brings us to the reckoning of December 2025. For years, US officials had warned that DJI drones could potentially route data back to China and posed a national security risk, claims DJI has consistently and firmly denied. Insisting users can fly fully offline. But under American law, a U.S. national security agency was required to complete a formal security review of DJI by December 23, 2025. That deadline arrived, and the review was never finished. So the government acted anyway. And it acted with a blunt instrument. Rather than naming DJI alone, it directed the Federal Communications Commission to add all new foreign-made drones and their critical components to its covered list, the official roster of equipment deemed an unacceptable risk to national security. In practice, that move blocks new DJI models from receiving the FCC authorization they need to be legally imported and sold in the United States. Crucially, and this matters, it does not ground the millions of drones already in American hands. Existing models keep flying. And remaining stock on shelves can still be sold until it runs out. But here is the part that exposes the whole trap the country built for itself. With DJI shut out of new sales, what exactly does America fly instead? The approved alternatives, the so-called blue UAS list of vetted, trusted domestic drones, are few in number, often several times more expensive, and in many real-world cases simply not as capable. A local police department, a search and rescue team, or a farmer who relied on an $800 DJI now faces a several $1,000 substitute. Assuming an equivalent one even exists for their job. And that is the uncomfortable moral of the entire story. You cannot ban your way out of a dependency that took 15 years to build. The hardware can be prohibited overnight, the manufacturing base, the engineering talent, and the supply chain to replace it cannot. That is the bill for letting one company quietly come to own the sky, and in December 2025, it finally came due. One company, one city, the whole world's skies. If this opened your eyes, subscribe for more stories on how Asia quietly took over the things we use every day.